Praise the Lord, guys. I'm Straw Greenhorn. And he said unto the disciples, a certain rich man had a steward. Now the same was accused of him that he was wasteful with his Lord's goods. So the Lord called him unto him and said, What is this that I hear of thee? Give an account of thy stewardship, for thou mayest no longer be steward. So the steward said within himself, What shall I do? For my Lord doth remove me from the stewardship. To dig I cannot, and to beg I am afraid. I am resolved on what I shall do when I am put out of the steward, that they might receive me into their houses. So he called unto him each of his Lord's debtors, and he said unto the first, How much owest thou unto my master? So here at the beginning of the 16th chapter of Luke, this is the story of the wasteful steward. Now, this is one of those that are maybe not so popular, but the lesson is so deep and so applying to life. And there's many hidden gems within this one. So we just saw the 15th chapter close off with the prodigal son. So, connecting these two stories, then you can say, well, the master, he was so happy to see his son, return after, asking for his inheritance and then going into that far country and wasting it, righteous living, and how he ended up feeding swine, would even consider eating the food that the swine was eating. He was so hungry. And how he came back home and, was ready to tell his father he's not worthy to be called thy son because he has been wasteful. So, exactly as what I was saying, what would this man have said if he was a servant and not a son? He would have said, thou art not worthy to be my servant anymore. So, we see the same scenario, right, of being wasteful. But whereas the son was well received because by blood, he was family and related. And, would receive his father's, goods when he is gone, right? Even though he did ask for it prematurely. So now we see it from the point of view of a servant. What if a servant was to do the same thing? I think that, the ending of this, 15th chapter and the beginning of the 16th, there's a gap, right? But, if we connect the two, we'll see that it's the same story, but, being told from a different person's perspective. So, we see it opening up here by saying, so then he said unto the disciples, a certain rich man had a steward. Now the same was accused, to his Lord that he had been wasteful with his goods. So now, still, a Lord and being over Lord of all, and having to deal with people, wasting his goods, his riches, his substance, his wealth. So, we see this parable, when he says a certain rich man, means that it's not a specific story. And no doubt it, these parables, they do happen and they happen throughout, so often. So, instead of, calling anybody's name to make them a spectacle, because then how would the people look at this person, in their day-to-day life? Keeping in mind that Jesus had just spoke this of them, right? He would be engaging in open gossip before all the people, right? I think the difference when he calls out the scribes and Pharisees, the Sadducees, the chief priests, elders, right, is that they are professing purity and holiness and piousness. They are professing to be pure in heart and in teachings and doctrine, and that they are the true authority of God. They're professing all these things and they're falling short and being hypocrites. So the difference when he calls them out, because I just said, open gossip, right? This is for their learning and understanding and teachings and for the people to understand what's really going on. So they don't, blindly entrust their care into these people that are being so reckless, versus this man, right? I mean, technically he's doing nothing wrong, right? He has his household. And first we saw the son come and ask for money, the inheritance. Now we see a servant, wasting this inheritance. So this man, he's not at fault, right? But in order to avoid being made a spectacle, about how he's running his house, he doesn't call any names. We know that there's a Bible verse that says, count those that rule over you worthy of double honor, especially if they, rule well. So if a man does not rule well, and you scandalize him like this, then, you're just adding fuel to the fire for this person, right? So a certain, rich man. So this man, he's rich, obviously. He has substance to spare. And this waste, as we see in both cases for the son and the servant, does not bring him to his knees, financially. It does not, end his reign, his empire. It does not shake the very core foundation. I think he would have to give away many more, of his substance to come to ruin by either this, steward or this son. So this man, he's doing well off, and he has so much going around. I think that, when a person reaches a certain level of wealth, they look at it differently, because they have so many avenues, right? I think that they can look at all things and see, okay, this one is producing. Let's, put more into this and diversify this one. This one is, is draining us. Let's get rid of this. Let's either sell it off or change what we're doing here to something else if we're gonna keep the space. So as opposed to when you were just starting out, how I don't know, maybe you had all your eggs in one basket. Maybe, especially if you built this from the ground up from nothing, coming not especially from a rich family. So, maybe you had just one arrow in your quiver to shoot, one bullet in the chamber, and this better hit, or what are we gonna do? We're gonna have to, maybe work a regular, job for a while, and, try again later when we are able to, amass enough, substance to make a meaningful attempt at something. Because, starting a business, it's not so easy. There's so many hidden costs of the location, cost of the materials, inventory, cost of manpower, operational cost. If you probably can't run it by yourself, how are you gonna pay people? And to start with nothing and then, have all these things, it's a huge leap, right? So, this rich man is described as being rich. So that, this lesson is more of a quality thing and not existential. We're about to be ruined. Poverty, right? In those days, if you owed, you could be sold, right? And payment be made. And I'm not sure what the redeeming. If you are of Israel, we know that the Jubilee in every 50 years they would release all debt. All land would be returned to the owner. All debts would be cancelled. If they're not fully paid. It was considered a year of release, and that was for the Jews. But for the other nations, no. If you owe them, you gotta pay them. And I'm not certain of that would mean you are their slave forever, or depending on how much you owe, that according to each year, a certain amount of it would have been paid off by your labor service. So we're seeing the steward enter in, introduced. So he's he had a steward. So we know that these stewards, you know they are like an acting master. We know that a steward, maybe he doesn't do so much of the manual labor or whatever the thing is about. He's not the one with his hands to the wheel, driving it, but he's more like a supervisor or a manager to make quality decisions and to solve problems. We understand that his strength is not what's pushing it forward, but he acts as the master when he's away to keep master's vision going forward, what he intended for this venture or organization to be. So acting in part of the master, we know that it's not his things, but he's over these things. And I think in life, how often people blur the line, right? I think people blur the line too many times in life when they have this kind of authority over another person's goods and how they can bring people to ruin. If you remember the Rocky, I believe, was it the third or the fourth one when he lost everything because his accountant, his lawyer, he borrowed the money to make a quick real estate deal, hoping that he would have made the profit and put back the money and then keep his profit. But then, it failed and everything was lost. So Rocky had to move back home. I think that this position, giving you so much authority, you sometimes blur the line. And that's exactly what he was doing because he had no right being wasteful, as we're going to see. He should have just, done things by the books, understanding that it's not his things. So, what he was essentially, doing was dipping, double dipping into the company assets and using this to, at his pleasure, right, at his discretion, being maybe overly generous so that he would receive a positive whatever it would be from these people. So he was using this to fund himself to a good social position, which I say we would see him later want to be received into others' house. So then if we observe you doing this to this man's house, what do you think that we would bring you into ours, right? This man, he's not thinking all the way through. So it was said that that this same steward had been wasteful. He had been accused that he had been wasteful with his lord's goods. So word got around. People talk, right? Was he out gambling at a table with drunkards, and maybe one of the other workers was there listening to him talk and putting two and two together to say, wait, hold on, I mean, how is it that you're talking like this? First of all, these aren't your things. And then to hear him give details, how I took this and I did that with it, I gave this to this person, and showing himself to be a big shot, essentially, you know being wasteful with the goods. That means that he was skimming somewhere, which means that either he was pocketing the money or he was taking these things for his use, but it was taken away from what the master was supposed to be receiving, cumulative. So, his, thing was at risk. So this same was accused, right? Was it one of the businessmen that was good friends with this lord that came and said, you know that your servant is doing X, Y, and Z? It's not said of who brought this onto his attention. But if you consider the possibilities, you could see that it could have been, one of his own workers that was there, eavesdropping. It could have been one of these business partners that he was being crooked with. It could have been like a accounting, discovery. that maybe he was, or somebody was looking at the books and, seeing, what's going on. How is it that, we're bringing in all these things, but, money is not matching sales, right? The money is not matching the things that we're putting out, we're giving out. There's a mismatch between, goods and payments. The specificity of how this, how he found out is not given. So then we see the next verse saying how, so then he called the steward unto him and said, how is it that I hear this of you? Give an account of thy stewardship, for thou mayest no longer be steward. So he confronted him directly. This is the boss, right? He's not going to sweep anything under the rug or be bashful, right? Or embarrassed or afraid. He's not going to be hesitant or timid of confronting this steward, right? And we understand that he's not a family member like the prodigal son, or as it would have been, mentioned. And like I said, even when I was, explaining that video, I asked the question, what if this was a worker and not a son? He would have been given the boot. He would have been told, yeah, you are not worthy to come back here. And this is exactly what this man is about to do. So there is a difference, right? Because, each man, he loves his own. And the mistake of the prodigal son is going to be received different than your mistake being only a worker. Now, for him to have gotten this position, as steward, that means that he had been working for at least, a good enough amount of time, and he had proved himself, to be trustworthy or to be capable of handling these things. So, can you understand that in life, sometimes people, they show you something to make you believe one thing when, deep down something else might be going on. How many people have gone for job interviews, being so professional, so, projecting an image of competency, but yet still, after a few, weeks or months, they're showing up late. They're, idling company time. They are, failing to meet expectations. They are, they're just doing all kind of things that they're not supposed to do. But at the interview, they were so, on point, showing that people, they have a tendency or ability to, show you what they think or expect, you would want to see. So then, one can ask the question, why not just be these things? Why live a double life? Because that's exactly what it is. Why not, be these things that you're professing? Raise your level of excellence. Raise your standard. I guarantee you, it can only benefit you in life. And not being, a two-faced, double standard kind of person. So he called him unto him, right? Did he know that the master had found out that he was wasteful before he got, called? Was he there nervous, waiting for this call, knowing that the master had found out, right? Like I said, not much detail is given in, these kind of things. But he called him unto him and said, how is it that I hear this of thee? So, this man, he's speaking like the real boss that he is. And he's not afraid to hold back, words, to hold back, position. He's taking it from a common sense point of view. It's like, have you lost your mind, right? I didn't bring you on for you to be doing these things. Did you think that I brought you on to do these things? He's setting up the dialogue so that, if you were to say, you're fired, that there could be no protest, there could be no appealing. He's laying everything down in such a way that, it's gonna cut through the tension, like a knife cutting bread, as what they say. It's gonna leave no room for this, steward to believe that he can, pull the rug over this master's eyes. How he can, beg for another chance. How he can continue to deceive him, which is what he's doing. Saying one thing and then doing another, saying one thing and then being another thing. So how is it that I hear this of thee? He didn't start with details, but he started with, a frame, emotion, right? I said that communication is, 93%, body language and 7% words. And when he called him, he didn't just get right down into the words, you are being wasteful with X, Y, and Z. But, instead he used the nonverbal, even putting forward such a general thing, which shows you that, arguing specifics, sometimes is not so much the best, thing to do to get what you're trying to do. But, there's more, ancient, antiquated, established, laws of human psychology, human behavior, human communication. And if you're able to tap into these things, you can, engage the deep, essence of what we are as human beings. And if you can master these things, then, you can call forth, so many great things in your life. Because, one would expect that he would have gone right into the details about what he's, wasting. But instead, he relied on the more powerful part, communication, which is body language, even though it's still words, but I can imagine his expression saying all these things. How is it that I hear this of thee? It's like, talking to a child, right? being the parent, how, you have authority over them, and they are subject unto you. So, this, steward, he wasn't, baffled on how to deal with this guy. So how is it that I hear this of you? And, this kind of question, it forces you to fight or flight, right? It pulls that reaction from you, letting you know that it's real and you can't manipulate your way out of this. Because, how is it that I hear this of you? It's setting down your foot, knowing that they can't come and try and manipulate you or pull a fast one on you. That you have them in your sights, and it's time to get real. We're being real right now, and you can either say something that's gonna help you or hurt you. But any trickery, any manipulation, any thinking that you can get by right now without facing what it is that I'm bringing onto you. So how is it that I hear this of you? How is it that I hear this of you? It's being absurd, even bringing shame upon you. Like I said, and after this kind of statement, then there's no wiggle room for this man. So give an account of that stewardship, for thou mayest no longer be steward. So you notice how he's laying it down, right? He's laying, control fully into his hands. And in such a way that if you were to, like I said, fire him, he would have nothing to stand on, nothing to appeal. He would have to just take it and go. So give an account of thy stewardship. So, show me that you've been doing what I've been paying you to do. Show me that you've been faithfully doing what I've set, you over to do. Because, you can no longer be stored based on what I'm hearing. I trusted you with these things and you took advantage. It shows that integrity is really what you do when nobody's looking. Even worse, when you have all the power to do it. And, he was obviously over all these ones. The one that reported him, like, if it was a worker, he was probably over him also. So, he couldn't go to him, directly, but he went to the boss. So give an account of that stewardship, for thou mayest no longer be stored. There's no wiggle room left, and this boss is in full control. So then the next verse says, so then he said within himself, what shall I do? For my Lord hath taken away the stewardship from me. To dig I cannot, and to beg I am afraid. So now, like I said, this is shaking him up inside. And this boss, he handled it so well. Like I said, when communicating, if you understand the human brain, right, that we have the cortex, and then we have the medulla on the pons, right? Now we know that the cortex is the more modern thinking brain, while the others are the more instinctual survival kind of brain. And in this modern world of language and technology, we over rely on the thinking brain, when these more instinctual brains, they have these things that are way more effective, I would say. Because if you look at two kind of guys, right, maybe one is kind of nerdy and really a smart thinker, but then the other one, he's more like animal, I hate to say animalistic, but he's more instinctual, and his physical presence is different. I think that people will more likely respect him than the smart thinker. There's something about this older brain, and this this boss, this master, he tapped into this older brain in dealing with this steward. So it shook him up. He had been putting his hands in the cookie jar so much, and feeling that he would have gotten away with it, and there was nobody that could stop him. He was drunk with power, and abusing this power, right? So the fact that somebody could shake him up is coming as a surprise to him. So what shall I do, for my Lord that taken away the stewardship from me? So if he had lived his life with this kind of frame and understanding, we see him being removed from the driver's seat right here, right? That's exactly what's going on with this answer. For my Lord doth take it away the stewardship from me. Reminding him that it is not his. And, he doesn't have a blood tie like the prodigal son does. And, he's being reminded, I believe right now, of the first day that he came to ask for this job. How he, showed up being hopeful, but not guaranteed to get anything. He's being put right back in that, frame of mind right now. When he showed up, asking for a job, and the boss maybe took him on as one of the lower positions, but then, maybe he showed a tendency of intelligence or whatever it was within him. Maybe he was there for a long time. His age is not told. Maybe he's an older gentleman where you would expect more wisdom from him than the others. What shall I do? We see a state of panic. So now he's gonna run through a scenario of all outcomes that can happen to him. If I lose this job, right, what is life gonna look like? If I lose this job, how am I gonna survive? If I lose this job, what will I do on a day-to-day basis? How can I get back on my feet if I lose this job? If I lose this job, it's not said if he has, wife or children, but he probably did. How am I gonna take care of them? The shame even that something like this is gonna be, because in those small towns, everybody knew everybody. And if he was to be, removed or something like this, who would trust him with anything? So you see him saying about digging or begging. If you think about it, it's just, you're getting paid for your labor, right? Or you're begging, asking for what people can give to you. It doesn't imply a control over anything, from a managerial, kind of, perspective. Understanding that no, he cannot be trusted in anything like that. So what shall I do for my Lord to take it away the stewardship from me? So now he's even, like being backed into a corner, powerless to charge or defend himself, totally at the mercy of his master. So what shall I do? Right? To dig I cannot, and to beg I'm ashamed. So if he's gonna lose this position of mind and intellect, so he's gonna have to resort to physical strength. So we know that he wasn't doing much heavy lifting, as I guessed, because now he's saying, I cannot dig. There was others that was doing heavy lifting of things like that. That he was over. I asked the question: was he older? Is that why he could not dig, or just, was he, inexperienced or underdeveloped, in body size and strength to be digging? To beg, I am ashamed. Because imagine him being over all these things, because he was the steward, which means that he was acting master even when the master was there, and maybe he was off, just maybe doing more personal stuff, with family, or just enjoying himself. Maybe not so worried because he has his steward to take all these things. Maybe he would give him his orders, telling him what he wants, to be changed, what he wants done, the direction he wants to move in with these things, giving him instructions on how to carry out, things that he wants. So to beg, I am ashamed, right? To go from being over all these other servants. How shameful would that be now if he is now on the street corner and they are walking to and from work and home, or the master sends them out somewhere and they see him, begging, and they look at him. It's not said how he treated them, if he treated them roughly or kindly. But, can you imagine if he did treat them roughly and then they see him like this, how they would mock him, right? And they would talk. And, even those that were his friends would look at him still a certain way, understanding that, he was removed for dishonesty. And I don't know, maybe word would get around and maybe people wouldn't even want to give to him while he's begging. He would be stigmatized, right? So to dig I cannot, and to beg I am ashamed. So we see the next verse says, so I am resolved on what I should do when I am put out of the stewardship, that they might receive me into their houses. So I am resolved on what I should do. That means, at first I was thinking it would mean he did not know what to do, but it's the opposite. He knew exactly what to do. So we see him being so cunning, right? So this man, he has such a cunning nature, so calculating. No wonder he, found himself doing this. If this was his personality, see how he came up with a solution, and how, we understand that in this story, the boss would, praise him for what he did. But, is it not dishonest? Giving this, because what he's doing, he's going to give discounts to everybody. And, I gave them the full service and products of what they asked for with no shortage. Why should they short me when it's time to pay me? These are businesses. It's not so much personal things, right? And we're not in businesses, things, are written down in the books as, debits or credits. And it's not feeling or anything personal, right? So now you're gonna make this personal by giving away my things. So you already gave, things away, and now you're gonna, give them even more away by giving everyone discounts. So, this boss, this, master, he's taking a loss because of this servant. That's the hard cold fact, right? Let's hope that profit of margin was great. The margin of profit was great, so that even though he did give discounts, he does still come out in the positive and not in the red, having lost anything. So I'm resolved on what I should do. I know exactly what to do. He's so quick on his feet. No wonder he, was getting away with this for so long. How he could, do what he did and then have things appear to be normal. If he's this quick on his feet and cunning, much more detail about, what he exactly did to be considered, wasteful is not given. But I think that that could help the story right now. And it also shows you that sometimes not because you're so sure about what you're doing, means that it's the right thing to do or it's the best thing to do. And not because you're hesitant means that it's a wrong thing or a bad thing to do. I think that, people have this, mistake, where this tendency where, if they feel completely strong about something, that means there's no way it could be wrong. And, on the opposite spectrum, you see some people hesitate when they have such great ideas and great solutions and such great promising things, tying this back to what I said earlier about the mind, the thinking mind versus the primitive mind. I found that, the smarter, thinking minds, that they're usually more hesitant and doubtful of their abilities, right? Having this great brain, right? I guess because you can say that the brain is so thinking that he can see all the possibilities and he can consider that it is wrong. But then, the more primitive mind, how these are usually the most confident, kind of people that you meet, right? And if you're gonna say, well, if they're opposite, if they're operating on this less mind and not so much the thinking mind, then they're more likely to be wrong compared to the thinking mind, right? But it's just something that accompanies the personalities of these two kind of brains, and that's why nerds, they say, are not so good with the opposite sex, especially as men, because they're more likely to see their own faults and shortages and errors, and over stress these things within themselves, right? And they come across as not so confident. But then the primitive mind, with this absence of this overthinking brain, appears more confident, right? And we know that confidence is good for the opposite sex, right? So I'm resolved on what I should do, so that when I am put out of the stewardship, they may receive me into their houses. So if you look at his thinking, right? This guy, he has the heart of a freeloader. Does he not? Based on what he's saying right now, he has the heart of wanting to be carried by others and not so much the one doing the carrying. You would even say, well, is even childish a little bit. Because only a child would expect their parent to care for them like this. So now what he's about to do is to go and look for a home to belong to, and not so much creating his own home. If he had been steward, he's seen the ins and outs of this business, right? And he's been working there for so long. Does he not have enough set aside where he can go and build his own house? I think that just the fact that what's going through his mind right now, it shows you who he is and what he's lacking. That this whole time, what he should have been building. I think that in life, when we are in places, we don't realize that we should be gathering. When we're in places, each environment, we should be gathering, right? Should be gathering knowledge, gathering the means to dominate this thing. Yeah, you might be under somebody else's leadership or management, but you should understand the thing so well that given a chance, you could surpass everything that you were a part of in experience, wisdom, knowledge, outcome. Because this man, he should have been, well, he was over everything. Does he not know how everything worked? Could he not see that, well, this is all it takes to have this? Okay, sorry. So then I'm gonna start out small and start with this, and then this will grow, and then after that I could move to this. He should have been having this kind of heart. But look at what he's saying right now. That when I'm put out of the stewardship, they may receive me into their houses. So he doesn't have the heart of a builder and a creator. And if you don't have the heart of a builder or creator, then putting him over your thing, it can only result in what happened. Because instead of and then it shows you there's two ways to look at things, right? You can look at them to expand them, or you can look at them to consume them. There's two ways to look at things. You can look at it to expand it, or you can look at it to consume it. And he was consuming this man's goods, right? So now, I mean, if you watch The Matrix, what did in the first one, Smith said to Neo that the human population is like a virus, that they consume every resource, right? And then the only way they can survive is to spread to another place. And that's what this man is doing, acting like a virus. So now he wants to go to somebody else's house where he should be starting his own right now. He has all the experience for sure, but he doesn't have the heart, right? He doesn't have the frame of mind. I'm pretty sure he could do it, but being stuck in these destructive mental cycles, and pattern of thinking and behavior. So he sees himself only as a consumer and not as a builder or an establisher, because he should be going to start his own thing right now. So I'm resolved what to do, that when I am put out of this stewardship, that others may receive me into their houses. Like I said, if we saw you come and do this to this man's house, what makes you think that we're going to bring you into ours? Is a great question, right? Because the irony is, whoever he was, if he was giving away his Lord's goods, I guarantee you, to get their approval or friendship, now when he's going to need a job, they're not going to take him. Because why? How did we become friends? By you giving away this man's things to us, right? So that if we bring you here, you're going to do the same thing to us, and then we're going to be in problems. So they may receive me into their houses. He's like a pet, like a dog or a cat. You feed him, you walk him. The danger is that he, was operating at this high level inside this man's organization. Like I said, how was he able to hide this within himself? That he's like this before, being promoted to something like this. Hopefully he didn't just come from somebody else's thing and then this man received him. Not looking for letters of reference or speaking to his old boss to see that he did the same thing over there. And then we put him, he came and told us that he was manager. So then we know that he had the experience, but we didn't know that he had this kind of, work ethic and, ethics, as the last one says. So he called unto him each of his lord's debtors, and he said unto the first, how much owest thou unto my lord? So he's bargaining, right? So, what was he not collecting these payments this whole time? Hopefully he wasn't stealing from the money bag like Judas, right? So, so this shows that sometimes, there's a style of thinking where, for some people, they will only produce under fire. They only produce, when, their livelihood is being threatened. That, when things are calm and stable, they can fall asleep and do all kind of things. These kind of people, you have to rule over them with an iron fist, which is, what this boss is doing to him right now. And look, he's starting to produce. So I think, in life, well, you can observe these things, right? And, know, who the person is that you're dealing with, if they work for you. Know who that person is, right? In context of this. And maybe, find somebody who, you don't need to be standing over them, threatening like this for them to, do what they're supposed to. But a person that has a natural inclination to just, do what is expected of them, without you having to threat, or stand over them, like this Lord is doing right now. Because now he's about to go and, collect all these debts. So he called unto him every one of his Lord's debtors and said, how much owest thou unto my Lord? So he's, bargaining, right? And about to, you know, try and give a statement for why he should stay. So we know that he was in charge of, collecting debt. All right, so here we are in the 16th chapter of Luke. To give a quick, summary of the 15th chapter, not word for word, but it's a summary. We saw it start out saying how publicans and sinners, gathered unto him to hear him, but the scribes and Pharisees murmured, said that he receiveth sinners and eateth with them. And he answered with them of the parable of the sheep, that which man among you having 100 sheep, if he lose one, do not leave the 90 at night in the wilderness and go seeking that which was lost till he find it. And if he find it, he layeth it on his shoulder and rejoice. When he reached home, he called all his friends and family, saying, come and rejoice with me, for I have found my sheep which was lost, showing how there's great joy in the presence, of heaven, how one sinner repenteth more than 99 just people that need no repentance. Then we saw the story of the woman with the 10 silver coins, that if she lose one, she light a candle and sweep the whole house, searching diligently till she find it. And when she find it, she also called together her friends and neighbors, saying, come rejoice with me. I found my peace which was lost, showing how there's great rejoicing in the presence of the angels of God over one sinner that repented. And then we saw the parable of the prodigal son, how a certain man had two sons, how the younger came to him and said, Father, give me the portion of goods that fall to me. And the father divided unto him his living. And not many days afterwards, he took a journey to a far country, and there wasted his substance with riotous living. And when he had spent everything, there arose a mighty famine in the land, and he began to be in want. So he went and joined himself to a citizen of that country, who sent him into the field to feed swine. Now, how he would have filled his belly with the husk that the swine did eat, and no man gave unto him. But when he came to himself, he said, how many of my father's hired servants have bread enough and to spare, and I perish with hunger? Then he said, I will rise and go to my father and say, I have sinned against heaven and before thee, and I'm no longer worthy to be called thy son. I pray thee, make me as one of thy hired servants. So he arose and came to his father, but when the father saw him, he had compassion on him and ran, fell on his neck and kissed him. Then he, started his old speech, I'm not worthy to be called thy son. But how the father interrupted him and told the servants to bring the best robe and put a ring on his hands and shoes on his feet, and bring the fatted calf and kill it, that we may eat and be merry, showing how his son was lost and is found, and was dead and is alive again. So they began to be merry. So now the older brother, he was in the field. When he came near to the house, he heard music and dancing. So he asked the servants what it meant. And they said, thy brother is returned, and thy father has killed the fatted calf, because he received him safe and sound. So this brother, he was angry and would not go in. So the father came out to speak to him. And the son said to the father, these many years I served thee, and I've never broken any of your commandments. And you have never given me a kid to make merry with my friends. But as soon as this your son is come, which had wasted your living with harlots, you have killed for him the fatted calf. Showing how the father said, son, you are always with me, and everything I have is thine. But it was necessary that we, make merry and be glad. For your brother was dead and is alive again, and was lost and is now found. So then here we are at the beginning of the 16th chapter of Luke, where it started out saying, and he said unto the disciples, a certain rich man had a steward, and the same steward was accused that he had been wasteful with his Lord's goods. So he called unto him the steward and said, what is this that I hear of thee? Give an account of thy stewardship, for thou mayest no longer be steward. So then the steward said within himself, what shall I do? For my Lord doth put me under the stewardship. To dig I cannot, and to beg I am ashamed. I am resolved what I should do, put under the stewardship, that they might receive me into their houses. So he called unto him each of his Lord's debtors, and he said unto the first, how much owest thou unto my Lord? I'm Straw Greenhorn.